seed of David. For unto the angels, which of the angels, as he said, Thou art my son, this day I have begotten thee. And again, I will be to him a father, he will be my son. And again, when he brings the first begotten into the world, he says, let all the angels worship him. The first begotten is a term of his resurrection. Before he was the only begotten son in the bosom of the Father. Now he's the firstborn from the dead. Why? Because he's the firstborn of many brethren. Why? Because of the blessing of Abraham to multiply him, make his name great. Now he's entered into his inheritance, and he's received the name that is greater than anybody. And he's received the throne. He's seated at the right hand of God. And he's received the sonship. Thou art my son, this day I have begotten thee. And I will be to him a father, and he will be to me a son. What is that? That's Samuel 7. 2 Samuel 7, when the Davidic covenant was promised to David, your seed. He will build me a house, and I will be to him a father, and he will be to me a son. That's called the Davidic covenant, which is made to the seed, which is Christ. So there's these vows in the Psalms, and these promises directly by covenant. And again, when he brings the firstborn into the world, he says, let all the angels of God worship him. Now you got a man that the angels of God are worshiping. This is the blessing. His name is so great that angels worship him. Did Abraham have that? No. This is the seed of Abraham, Christ. And unto the angels, he said, who makes his ministers flames of fire. But unto the Son, he says, thy throne, O God, is forever and ever. A scepter of righteousness is the scepter of your kingdom. This is the blessing. You have loved righteousness and hated iniquity. Therefore God, even your God, has anointed you with the oil of joy above your fellows, or your fellow brethren. This is the ultimate blessing, the oil of joy. Remember, Isaiah says, we'll enter into Zion with crowns of everlasting joy, with singing, with crowns of everlasting joy. John says, I write these things to you that your joy may be full, and that you may fellowship with us, and our fellowship is with the Father and the Son. This is the point. It's not just the kingdom and subjecting. That's all. I want you to have an atmosphere that's free from fear, anxiety, adversaries, affliction, death, sorrow. But it's not just that I'm removing negative things. I've anointed you with the oil of joy. Now, we think this is talking about Christ, and we remove it for ourselves, but he's not talking about Christ apart from us. He's talking about the great salvation that Christ entered into on our behalf. He already had all this. He didn't have to become the seed of David to get it. But he became identified with us, partook of flesh and blood, suffered, and learned obedience through the thing he suffered, so that he could be the captain of our salvation and bringing many sons to glory, and be one with those he sanctifies, and not ashamed to call them brethren, and declare the name of the Father from within us, the church, and sing praises to him, and say, behold, I and the children you've given me. I'm trying to impress you with the lengths God went to get you. And the reason he did was for your joy. Now, the blessing of Abraham is the multiplication of Christ, and it's the promise of the Spirit which we've received, which is the joy. The reason we can rejoice with joy unspeakable and full of glory is because we see him, which he is our living hope, and we know everything is subject to him. We know all things are working together for our good. We can relax about our life, and we can taste him, because the Spirit is the pledge of the inheritance. He's the foretaste. There's a taste. He called Paul calls this taste the pledge of the Spirit. After you received this, after you heard the gospel, the word of the truth of your salvation, and believed it, you were sealed with the Holy Spirit of promise, who is the pledge guaranteeing the inheritance. He's the taste of the inheritance to come. And the ultimate expression of that taste, or blessing, or inheritance, or reward, is Christ as your joy. And so the Spirit, I asked, why, I'm going all over the place, I know that. But I asked, he came and destroyed, through death, he destroyed him who had power over death, that he may deliver those who through fear of death were subject to bondage all their lives. Well, that's good. He took the fear away. What does he replace it with? Joy. The atmosphere that is opposite of fear is joy. All your fears are gone. You're not afraid of anything more. And you're strengthened within with all might, according to his glorious power. Colossians says, he prays that you be filled with the knowledge of his will and all spirit and all wisdom and understanding, that you may walk worthily of the Lord to please him in all things, bearing fruit in every good work, strengthened with might unto all endurance and long-suffering with joy, giving thanks to the Father who has qualified you for the share of the allotted portion of the saints in the light. Are you seeing what the share is and how qualified you are? Who has delivered you out of the authority of darkness and into the kingdom of the Son of his love. You're strengthened with might unto all endurance and long-suffering with joy, giving thanks to the Father. This is what the knowledge of his will does. He prayed that you'd be filled with the knowledge of his will, to walk worthily of him unto all pleasing. Now, to walk worthily of him unto all pleasing is to be an ambassador of Christ, which means you have to know him. And as you know him, all you can do is be filled with joy, strengthened within by this knowledge, and then it overflows with thanksgiving. And I've said before, I did a message called The Thankful Heart Is Good Enough. There's no work required of you. Nothing. But what pleases God is for you to be filled with the knowledge of what he's done until it overflows with thanksgiving. And you look up thanksgiving the way Paul used it in Philippians is like the expression. He says, even if I'm poured out as a drink offering on the sacrifice and service of your faith, I rejoice and joy with you all. The drink offering is a type of our enjoyment of Christ in this age that is poured out on other things. So the sacrifice and service of your faith. They used to pour the drink offering on the burnt offerings. The drink offering represents our enjoyment and appreciation of what God has done. And it's not just an appreciation like, oh, I know I need to say thank you. It is an overflow of thanksgiving produced by the joy of the Lord, which is our strength. To where Paul said, I'm a drink offering. I'm being poured out. My death is going to be a pouring out of a drink offering. I am so full of the rejoicing and the joy with you all because of the taste of the Spirit and the knowledge of Christ. Because he's been anointed with oil of joy above his glad brethren, not because he wants to be over them forever, but because he wants to share it with them. He received it on their behalf. That's what we need to see about our brother and our high priest and our bridegroom, is his whole purpose was not to be a king over us. The Israelites asked for a king because they wanted to be like the nations. And so God gave him Saul to show him what kings are like, but then he gave him David to show him what his mercy is like, and he gives him the seed of David to show us that the greatest in the kingdom is the servant of all. It's a totally different concept. Satan asked Jesus, he said, if you worship me, I'll give you all the kingdoms. He showed him all the kingdoms of the world in all space and time, every age, all the riches. He said, all of it's yours if you'll worship me. Why didn't he accept that? He could be the king. Because he didn't come to be a king. When the disciples were excited that the Greeks had come to talk to him, some rich guys, they're like, this is influence. Hey, Jesus, the Greeks want to see you. They were so excited about it. He said, indeed, it is the time for the Son of Man to be glorified. He knew that they wanted him to be gloriously beheld by these people and uplifted. There were times when the Jews tried to make him a king too. But he said, indeed, it is the time for the Son of Man to be glorified. Then he said, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it abides alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. He was telling him what manner he would be glorified. When he was going to Jerusalem to die. He said, Father, glorify your name. And the voice from heaven said, I have glorified it and will glorify it. We look at the cross as like a defeat. What is a defeat? It was a defeat of him who had power over death, that is the devil. It was the stripping off of the principalities and the disarming and the making of an open show of them as he blotted out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, condemned sin in his flesh, became sin and terminated it there, terminated Satan, destroyed all the corruption, swallowed up in himself, and released his life. It wasn't just a terminating work, it was also a releasing work where the life within him, into your hands I commit my spirit, that life released to be made a blessing for everyone. The last Adam became the life-giving spirit to be multiplied, to enter into the blessing. That's why it says in Hebrews, for the joy set before him, he endured the shame of the cross. He endured the cross, despising the shame. We think, well, that means you better do it too. You better not be ashamed and you better suffer. No, he had a motivation. It was the joy set before him. Now, he knew what this was. He knew the oil of joy was coming because it had already been prophesied, and he is the word anyway. He knew that he was going to be the seed of Abraham. He knew he was going to enter into the blessing, and he knew he was going to be able to say, behold, I and the children you've given me. And he was going to be able to cry, Abba, Father, from within the church. And he was going to have the church as his body, his fullness. And he was going to be multiplied and given a name higher than and bring man to the throne of God in heaven, to sit him at the right hand of God and subject everything to him, this great salvation, so that angels are even subject to man, and even man is above angels, even though he's made lower than angels, crowned with glory and honor. Okay, so that's our hope and our destiny, and it's all secured in justification. Can't do anything to earn it. And yet, even more, it's not just a hope for tomorrow. It's a taste for today. And that taste is also called the blessing. So Paul said in Galatians, where was that sense of blessing you spoke of? Because they lost the sense of blessing when they moved away from the gospel. There's a sense of blessing that many Christians have when they first get saved that disappears quickly when religious people come and try to help them and move them away to another gospel. Okay, and then they think the rest of their life, how can I get back to, I need a revival. So how can I get back to that place? I used to be so fervent. They're so focused on themselves. They don't see that their initial zeal was actually just an outpouring of the Spirit, and they were so full of the acknowledgement of Christ and enjoying him that they couldn't help but talk about him. They think, I used to witness, and I used to pray, and I used to read my Bible, and I don't know what happened. It's all gone. I'm a terrible person. And how am I going to get it back? I need to rekindle that first love. They misidentified the first love and think it was their love for God. They didn't know God. What they had in the beginning was an overflow of appreciation that Jesus was real and this had actually happened. And that's what they lost, because they've been moved away from him who called them to another gospel, which is not another, only some sought to trouble them by perverting the gospel of Christ. They got a perversion of the gospel of Christ that got them focused on themselves, and now when they want to get back to that place of enjoyment, they lost the joy and they know it. They think that it was all about them and their works. I used to be so zealous. I used to pray and I used to read the Bible, and I got to do that again, and I'm never going to do that again. I'm probably going to be the garbage man in heaven. That's not what the Lord is doing. He is going to revive us. I've said since the beginning of this channel that there's a season of refreshing coming through the knowledge of the Lord to those who are actually guarding their crown. As he approaches, it's going to become more and more clear what we have in Christ. And that knowledge becomes our joy. It rekindles the first love because we can actually see and appreciate now what we didn't understand at the beginning. At the beginning, we got the taste without knowledge. That's why we didn't know how to maintain it. We didn't know what we had. We were so full of joy, but it was based on a very incomplete knowledge. So it was easy for us to be carried off as spoiled. We were babes. But now we're coming back to that which we heard from the beginning with a much fuller appreciation, because we've been through so much. We've been in the back end. We've seen the shadows. We know what it isn't. And now we're learning again what it is with a full, mature knowledge, the meat of the word. So the meat of the word is related to the milk in that it's just a richer version of the milk. It's what you received from the beginning, but now with knowledge. That's what we're talking about here. So Hebrews 6, let me just read it, okay? And then I gotta stop. I've been driving all over the city. I just had to. Okay. He says, for when God made a promise to Abraham, because he could swear by no greater, he swore by himself, saying, surely blessing I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply you. That's the seed. And after he endured, he obtained the promise, which ultimately is Christ. When Christ came, Sarah called it, he wasn't Christ, but he was the seed. And in their mind, he might as well have been Christ. That's why Abraham offered Isaac, because he believed that God would raise him from the dead. He was a type of Christ. He knew that that was the seed. He knew he was acting out prophecy too, by the way. But so when Abraham received the promise, it was when Isaac was born. And he had to wait for that. He had to walk around considering not his own body though dead, and the barrenness of Sarah's womb, but waxing strong in faith, he gave glory to God, counting that he who promised was faithful. He was able to do what he did because he's the one who calls those things that are not as though they are and gives life to the dead. This is the life of faith and patience, while we wait for Christ to be manifested and made known to us. Well, when that happens, that's when you're receiving the promise. It's not just that when you get resurrected, then you receive the promise. It's when Christ starts to actually be made known to you and become your joy. You can't make the knowledge of Christ happen. Only God can do that. And he has to bring you through many things before you'll even accept it. Very few people listen to these kind of messages. But anyway, for verily men swear by the greater. He obtained the promise, which is when Isaac came. But so here's men. They swear by the greater, and an oath for confirmation is an end of all strife. Now he says the same thing in Galatians. He says, though it's a man's covenant, after it's made, no one can add conditions and disannul it, right? Well, here he's kind of saying the same thing, but then he says, but a mediator is of two parties, but God is one. And there in Galatians 3, he's making the point that the everlasting covenant was established between God and Christ, and God is one, and there's not a mediator between God and God. And if a man's covenant, you can't add conditions to disannul it. Even God, when he gives the law for transgressions until the seed to whom the promises are made should come, that law can't disqualify the heirs. And he was arguing, look, you can't get the blessing, nor can you be disqualified from it by the law. The blessing came from a covenant that God made with Christ 400 years later in Abraham's time when Abraham was asleep, and that's the basis of your justification and your blessing. And the way the devil steals your blessing is just to tell you that you can have it, but you're disqualified for it if you sin. You're disqualified from the blessing. You can't have the joy. You can't know Christ because you sinned. And until you get that right, there's no way. And yet only Christ could deal with sin. And that's part of the knowledge he brings to you. So after he endured, he obtained the promise. For men swear by the greater, and an oath for confirmation is an end of all strife. No reason to argue that oath has been made. That's with men. But God, because he could swear by no greater, he says he swore by himself. Therefore God, willing more abundantly to show to the heirs of promise the immutability of his counsel, confirmed it by an oath. So we have a promise and an oath, that by two immutable things, the promise and the oath, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we might have a strong consolation who have fled for refuge to lay hold of the hope set for us. Now remember, when God uses hope, he's not using it in the way we do. Oh, I hope that happens. No, the fleeing for refuge is a reference, by the way. In the Old Testament, they would run to the altar and lay hold of lay hold of the horns of the altar, because if you touched the altar, you were most holy, and therefore it was considered safe. Like playing tag, you go hit the safe place. I'm safe. Okay, to lay hold of to flee for refuge. The city of refuge was for manslaughter. for killers. They could go live in a city of refuge, and even though the penalty of death was over them, the sentence wasn't carried out upon them because they lived in refuge, in the city of refuge where you couldn't do that. Christ is our city of refuge. And yeah, we died with him because he bore the chastisement for us. And we take refuge in him. And we fled for refuge. Now that also is another allusion to the vengeance that was coming to Jerusalem for the blood of the prophets. They fled Jerusalem. All the people that were being written to in the time Hebrews was written had fled Jerusalem because they knew the judgment was coming. That's why when he talks about vengeance in Hebrews, they know exactly what he's talking about. They knew Jerusalem was going to be judged. Jesus had prophesied it. And they were going to, all the blood of the prophets from Abel to Zechariah was going to be required of that generation, and not one stone was going to be left upon another. The greatest siege in the history of Jerusalem. So a lot of people think that it was the Great Tribulation, and it wasn't. That vengeance was coming. It was pending. And so to flee for refuge was to go to Christ and get out of the city. Don't go back to the temple. So he's talking about a literal thing, but it also applies to us because we had a sentence of death over us. And yet we fled to Christ for refuge because of a promise and an oath. We didn't know there was a promise and an oath. We just knew there was Jesus. But he is the embodiment of a promise and an oath that God made. And when we have full knowledge, we get into the meat of the word, we start to see these things. By two immutable things, the promise and the oath, it was in which it is impossible for God to lie, we have strong consolation who have fled for refuge to lay hold of the hope set before us, which hope we have as an anchor for the soul, both sure and steadfast. See, this is not an uncertain thing. And which enters into that which is in the veil, where our forerunner is entered for us, even Jesus, made a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Now he's going to develop this argument, but he's already been saying it. In the midst of all these Psalms he quoted Psalm 110, which is a Davidic psalm to the seed of David that says, "My God said to my God, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool." And then he says, "I have sworn and declared the decree. You are a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek forever." And the high priesthood of Christ is what Hebrews is about, within the veil, and it is his position as the one who comes with the blessing, represented by the cup and the bread. He comes with bread and wine, but it's not a solemn communion. It's not a Last Supper. This is in the 8th day of resurrection, not connected to a Sabbath and offerings and sin. This is connected to the power of an endless life. Melchizedek was like the Son of God. He's going to argue this in Hebrews 7, having neither beginning nor end. And when he came to Abraham, there was bread and wine. But what was that bread and wine for? It was to celebrate the victory that Abraham was blessed of the Most High God, who'd give him the great victory over the 5 kings, and he was sitting in the midst of their spoil. And he tithed 1/10 of it, okay? And that's where we get tithe from. But that tithe wasn't an ordinance. It was literally based on a victory that God had supernaturally secured for Abraham in the midst of all these enemies. And by the way, if you examine those enemies, you find out that there were Nephilim among them, principalities. One of them was like an Antichrist. His name, Adonai-Zedek, meant the Lord of Righteousness. It was a prefigure of putting down. There's all these shadows in prophecy, and it was a prefigure of Christ putting down the Antichrist and receiving his kingdom. There's Abraham after having defeated the kings, the Antichrists, and he's enjoying the spoils of the victory in front of the priest king, Melchizedek, who is a type of Christ. And he brings bread and wine. Now the bread and wine is the ministry of Christ to nourish us with the victory that he won over the devil, and to actually give us the benefit of sonship. And this is within the veil. What is within the veil? The holiest. What was the holiest? It was where the Spirit dwelled, that was inaccessible in the Old Testament, especially to those who are under law. Now the veil's been entered into. The veil was taken out of the way, and Christ entered in through the veil of his own flesh as the captain and the forerunner to bring many sons in glory. And now he's given us access to the holiest and even made our spirit the holiest. And there he is as our Melchizedek. And we're like Abraham. He says, I'll make a table for you in the presence of your enemies. David, another Davidic psalm, talking about the shepherding of Christ. And remember, the everlasting covenant makes Christ the shepherd of the sheep. And he talks about how the Lord is my shepherd. He makes me to lie down in green pastures, leads me beside still waters. And then he talks about how even though I go through the valley of the shadow of death, I don't fear evil. Your rod and your staff is with me. They comfort me. They keep me straight. The discipline of the Lord is a comfort, by the way, but I'm trying to get into all that. And then he says, you prepare a table for me in the presence of my enemies, and you anoint my head with oil. And that's the oil of gladness. And surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I'll dwell in the house of the Lord forever. This is the shepherding of the Lord. It is a dawning realization, first of rest. I'm so tired. Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. I'm meek and lowly. You'll find rest for your souls in me. Learn of me. Take my yoke upon you. Yoke to me. I don't have a burden. My burden is light. So we start to learn grace by dropping all the religious burdens. And he makes our soul to lie down. He makes us to lie down beside still waters and green pastures. And even he teaches us that all of our days are ordered and he's working all things together for our good. So we stop fearing. I won't fear evil. Even if I go through the valley of the shadow of death, I don't fear. You're with me. See, we start to learn he's the source of life and he's for us. That's growth along the way. But then as we come into the full assurance, we mature into a place where we say, you make a table for me in the presence of my enemies. I'm like Mephibosheth. I was weak, but because of a covenant David made with Jonathan, who I didn't even know, one of my forefathers, I'm seated at the king's table. You should know that story. It's a picture. Because of a covenant God made with someone else, Christ, you've been seated at the table. He makes a table for me in the presence of my enemies. They're barking at me, calling me antinomian, telling me I'm looking for a license to sin. Whatever. Praise God. And he anoints my head with oil and causes me to drink of the cup of salvation and feast in his presence. This is Melchizedek. He's our shepherd, and he's gentle, and he leads us beside the still waters and gives us rest, and then he starts to give us the knowledge of himself to strengthen us. And this is like the oil and the wine for the beaten Samaritan, the guy going down to Samaria, away from Jerusalem. He's been beaten, set upon by thieves and robbers, and there's a Samaritan, well, that's Christ, who takes us on his shoulders and carries us to the inn and gives us a place to be taken care of and nourished and our wounds healed. But not only that, he brings us into the feast. That's his goal, is the joy and the fellowship. And it becomes he crowns you with glory and honor. Okay, this is the blessing and this hope. See, it's all based on the knowledge that I really believe. I said that the key of David is the everlasting covenant. Seeing the everlasting covenant and its significance, and seeing who Christ is in the light of what was promised to him, and seeing our salvation in that light is the key of David. Remember in the church of Philadelphia, he says, look, you have a little strength, meaning the least amount of strength, but you've kept my word and you've not denied my name. Behold, I'll make those in the synagogue of Satan come and worship before your feet and know that I have loved you. But that's not the big thing. He says, I have the key of David, and I shut what no man shuts and open what no man opens. I've set before you an open door. There's a door that can't be shut. And I believe it's the door of knowledge of who Christ is. That will actually bring us into the rapture. I think there's a group of people that will be so running towards Christ because of the abundance of the knowledge of him, that through that knowledge, Peter says, he furnishes an abundant entrance into the kingdom. We're going to our wedding day running towards our bridegroom. Whereas some others who also have been wed to him but didn't grow in the knowledge of him are going to have to be dragged kicking and screaming down the aisle to marry this guy that they're afraid is going to beat them when they see him and stick him in the kitchen and make him work. There's a lot of people, most people believe that when they see Christ, he's going to beat them and then put them to work or put them in the outer darkness. But at least they're saved. Those people are going to be raptured too. But what condition are they going? Well, they're being dragged, kicking and screaming, crying. Whereas if we grow in the knowledge of Christ, desire the sincere milk of the word that you may grow thereby, because by it there's these exceeding great and precious promises, that by these you might become partakers of the divine nature, and through the knowledge of him he ministers to us an abundant entrance, this is all Peter, into the kingdom. The abundant entrance is I'm running to him because of the knowledge of him. We've fled for refuge to lay hold of a hope set before us, and this hope is based on a covenant, that has a promise and an oath, and the promise is that Christ would be blessed, and that's the blessing, and be multiplied and be given the oil of joy and the great name and the great salvation. He's entered into it all. But how am I going to enter into it? I can barely relate to God. Well, he's become the high priest, and this is the oath. The promise is that he'll bless me. The oath establishes Christ as a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. Now, what's his job? His job is to bring me the riches of the spoil of his victory and celebrate it with me in the presence of his enemies and my enemies, and teach me to eat it, and strengthen me within to eat it, and to even be, I can't cry, Abba, Father. I'm an orphan. I don't even know who God is. Well, so he gives me the Spirit of the Son who cries, Abba, Father, within me. He becomes the relationship. He carries out his relationship with the Father from within us to bring us into the joy that he has. That's why he was crowned with joy. He was given the oil of joy above his brethren, not so that he would be above them forever, but so that he could serve them with it as the captain of their salvation, as the high priest, to minister that joy to them. I'm not going to enjoy Christ. This is not about your spirituality. Okay, this is not about you being more spiritual or having a more disciplined practice or reading the Bible more or praying more, although it issues in all those things. This is the high priesthood of Christ in your weakness, interceding for you to make sure that the riches that are yours are made known to you. And he does it through the New Testament ministry. He does it through stewards. He does it through the economy of grace in his household to make sure that the heirs are equipped with what they need. And there is, for some reason, an element of free will here, where once you've tried to minister grace to people and let them actually know who Christ is, and you see genuine believers fighting against it and rejecting it and saying, I don't want that, that's your reward is Christ, come on, no, I'm working for it. It's not that they're not saved. They're resisting the grace, kicking and screaming all the way. If God really, they say that if God doesn't get everything he wants, that means he's a failure. Because they only think of the milk, which is eternal judgment, faith towards God. Everything is in light of, am I going to be in the lake of fire or not? But if you understand that grace is all the way through, God, with his high priest, doing everything he can to work with you, to bring you into the knowledge of Christ and how much is in us that resists, then we have a free will here. Now, it's true. Without the high priest, without God's promise, without the Spirit, without his drawing, without the word, he doesn't exhaust, but he bends over backwards to make sure everything we have is there. Everything we need is there so that we can enter into this joy. But there has to be something in us, some willingness, some knowledge. And even that's by him. It is entirely by grace. Okay? But if we're all going to enjoy the allotted portion of the saints in the light, and we're co-heirs with Christ, then you can't say, well, God selected you to only have a little bit of grace, and God selected that guy to have a whole lot of grace, and it's all sovereign, it's all his will. No, we're all going to have all the grace. But in this life, this is where free will really does make a difference. Not in your eternal salvation as a son and an heir. That's secure. But how much grace are you going to enjoy today? Maybe you're so busy arguing that for predestination, your perverted version of it, that you don't enjoy any grace. Because all you do is fight and argue about the same thing every day. And every video you do for years is to prove how right you are about man not having free will, while you decide every day not to enjoy Christ. No, sorry, I did pop to mind. And I almost never talk about those guys. But, there's something in us that can resist the grace of Christ, and it doesn't mean that you're not working hard enough. It means that you just won't accept the fact that he has done everything and he's taken care of everything. It's like you won't accept his sovereignty. You know, the grace, the free will is to resist his sovereignty. But it's real. We can really resist and inhibit our growth and stay occupied with our lust, which isn't your lust for watching your favorite movie. It's your lust for religious edutainment. That's what I see in the Christian community, is that, you know, like that, my search app, it's so powerful. And yet I see very few people exploring it. If you'd explored it, you'd see how powerful it is. Not just try the search thing, but start looking through the categories and stuff. You'd see how much is there. I see very few people doing that. But you know what? I stick a cartoon figure named Eliezer up and make him be able to chat with people. Then all of a sudden people want to use it. And when I take it away because it's getting crazy, and he'll come back, but then everybody stops using it again. What is that? It's a lust for religious edutainment. That is why you listen to all these different teachers and don't confirm the word yourself and don't want to study it, you know. And I don't study the word as a work. I study because of what I'm seeing. And that's, once you start seeing these things, you can't get enough. It just creates an appetite. It's Christ nourishing you. Okay, this was much longer than I thought, and I really didn't get into it, but the promise to Abraham was that I will bless you and multiply you. And the oath that confirmed it was to David when he made Christ the high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. The reason God made him king, he was already king, he's the Ancient of Days, is not so that he can rule. It's so that he can give away the kingdom. He came to serve. And you'll never enjoy the kingdom if he doesn't minister it to you. And that's what the high priesthood is. That is the anchor, the oath that is accompanied with the promise that I will bless you and multiply you, and then the oath is I've made him a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek forever. These two things together become two immutable witnesses, and they become an anchor for the soul to bring it within the presence within the veil. Now what's there? The rest, the inheritance, the enjoyment, the feast, everything. It's the Spirit. It's the oracle of God. It's where God is in your spirit, available to you. It's all the realities of the great salvation to bring you to the end of the faith, the salvation of your souls, rejoicing with joy unspeakable and full of glory, even rejoicing like Paul in Philippians. That is all from the enjoyment of this great salvation that comes by knowledge, in a subjective way where Christ is actually feeding you with it, and he brings your soul as an anchor. See, when I went through Hebrews, I made an analogy of a kite, where our soul is like a kite flapping in the wind in the holiest and in the wilderness, back and forth, back and forth. It goes out, and sometimes it's doing sacrifices around the sacrifices, and sometimes it's around out in the wilderness wandering around. None of those places are where our soul is supposed to be. So there's a string that attaches the kite to the one who holds it, and that's Christ. And where is he? He's within the veil, and he's tied it to the Ark of the Covenant. And he's got this big crank, and he's cranking in the kite so that eventually the kite is not flapping around in the wind out there, but is actually resting tied to the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies. That's our soul. That's what he wants to do. What is your soul? It's your mind, will, and emotion. The end of your faith, the salvation of your soul, is that your soul would eventually be in the presence of God, that your attention would be there, that your emotions would be fixed and that your head would be anointed with oil, and that you'd be rejoicing with joy unspeakable and full of glory in the presence of your enemies, and nothing can do anything to me. I'm just full of boldness before God. The spirit of bondage and fear is gone, and I'm just enjoying my portion here. And that would be Christ in you as life, magnified in your body. So Paul said, this shall turn out to be your salvation through your petition in the bountiful supply of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, that as always, even now, Christ will be made magnified in my body. That's what he wants, is Christ to be glorified in you. And that is an evangelist. That is an ambassador for Christ, who knows that God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespass against us, and has given us the ministry of reconciliation. That's our word. That's our ambassadorship. That, look, our sins are forgiven, and we can stand in his presence, and I'm enjoying him now, and it's totally changed me. I'm a totally different person. There's Christ pouring out of me because of the knowledge of him. And it's not a religious kind of change where I'm holier and better than you. It's a change where I want you to have this joy. That's the motivator of the apostles. That's what, John said, we write these things to you that you may have fellowship with us, and our fellowship is with the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ. We write these things to you that your joy may be full. And that is the ambassadorship that reflects God's heart in sending his Son. That's why the angels said when, Christ was born, there was singing in heaven and the shepherds saw it. Peace on earth and goodwill towards men. What? In whom he's pleased. What? No, it's wrath upon them all. He hates them. No. God was pleased to bruise Christ. He shall see the travail of his soul. He sees the fruit. And he was pleased to do it? Why? Because of what he gets. For the joy set before him. We are the joy as we enjoy him. And this is called in Ephesians the riches of the glory of God's inheritance in the saints. We're not anything in ourselves, but as Christ is in us and made known to us, and the riches of who he is are multiplied in us, we become transformed, and we become a garden full of fragrances of Christ to God. And we are full of joy, and he is full of joy. It'll be a mutual satisfaction forever.